Welcome to the Argosy podcast. I'm your host, Greg Marin, and with us today we have as our guest Dr. Krendl Gilbert from Hortus AI. Tom, welcome.
Thanks very much. Happy to be here.
Tom, you have a doctorate in machine as a machine ethicist and also in epistemology from UC Berkeley, and your work sits kind of at the intersection of AI, philosophy, governance, and public accountability. So with that in mind, you have described yourself as a machine ethicist, as you are, building tools for more interpretable and moral AI. What first pulled you into this work, and why did you feel it mattered enough to build Hortus AI around it?
The stakes for me were very personal. So initially, it had nothing to do with AI. It had to do with really my background and where I grew up. So I grew up in Appalachian, Ohio, part of the country that has always been not just poor and mistreated, but really misunderstood, especially by the rest of the country. I think it's pretty endemic to the culture there. And I grew up on a farm. So, I mean, I really was right at the heart of it. And what that experience taught me was that when people are exposed to systems, even systems that are intended to help them, whether that's healthcare or education or the job market or what have you, and they feel betrayed by those institutions because they feel misrecognized or misunderstood or not properly helped by them, they learn to be cynical. They learn to distrust those institutions. And eventually they learn to distrust the world as a whole. So zoom out. When I was in grad school in the mid 2010s and AI was happening, it became clear to me that two things were about to happen. One was that the world would be changed by this technology. I understood how it worked. I understood the algorithms behind the latest capabilities. Those are now the same algorithms that power, ChatGPT and Gemini and stuff like that. So that moved me intellectually, but I was also morally moved and spiritually moved by my awareness that the way the world would be changed is that it would look and feel and taste like Appalachia, but everywhere. What AI would do was make it even easier to create systems that impacted people, that classified people, that reshaped people's lives in ways that by default were not going to respect their wishes, their concerns, their priorities, their values. And so for me, actually, it was a very natural fit to then design an interdisciplinary doctorate in what I call machine ethics and epistemology, which is really just another way of saying, how do we build these systems to be good? And how will we know that we have succeeded in doing that? That's all
Gotcha.
that moniker meant.
Gotcha. And does that become a little bit more urgent due to the fact that we're at maybe the cusp of quantum computing being merged with AI?
Well, it's
Or does
certainly
that
urgent. So, as I said, it was clear to me and to many of us in the early days of this field. For me, it was spring 2016 when this stuff was happening. That's when DeepMind released AlphaGo, which was this program that, if your listeners might recall, like it was a little over 10 years ago now. But that was the first real dress rehearsal for reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning is the kind of secret sauce behind the capacity for AI to become, in many ways, intelligent in the same way humans are, generalized intelligence, because it really just became a function of setting up an environment in which any agent could learn some optimal behavior. And the more data we had and the more compute we had, the bigger those environments could be and the more robust the behavior that could be learned. So, as I said, I sort of saw the early days of that hockey stick, over a decade ago. It was really, because it really just became a matter of saying, how can we redefine any human activity under the sun in terms of some arbitrarily learnable, partially observable environment, and just throw enough data at it that some agent can learn how to do that task, whatever it may be, better than a human. So I think it's only become more urgent, to answer your question, because now what we've seen, especially since November 2022, which was sort of the Sputnik moment for chatbots, it really became clear this was not only technically possible, but fully monetizable. And so that convergence of technological advancement with market forces is what has made this into an existential concern.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Appreciate that in-depth answer. Your background spans philosophy, sociology, political thought, and AI research. How has that mix shaped the way you think about AI differently from, say, the average founder or engineer?
That's an interesting question. For me, the common denominator in that background is that these are always, for me, human questions. They're not questions about uh, the Terminator or HAL 9000 or, whatever sci-fi image of robots or advanced AI may come to your listeners' heads, when they close their eyes. That's really not what it's about. It's really about how developing a technology this powerful forces us to ask new questions about ourselves. It's actually funny that, I was watching with my wife just recently the Artemis 2 mission, which, just went around the moon. And it's the first time we've done that as a species in, over half a century. They've gone farther than any human has technically ever gone from the surface of the Earth. And I remember when there was a moment when the capsule went behind the moon, and there's a 40-minute window during that time when they're no longer in contact with the Earth, because there's no possibility for radio signals to kind of penetrate the moon. So they're effectively in darkness, like complete darkness, completely cut off from us. And when they then came around the shadow of the moon and came back into sight of Earth, one of the astronauts on that mission said something that was incredibly moving and evocative to me and resonated a lot with the spirit I try and bring to my work in AI, which is that she said, and I'm paraphrasing here, I don't have the quote right in front of me, but she basically said, in doing this mission, we do not leave the Earth, we choose it. And I think what that statement meant was that when we, as a species, expand our horizons, when we step out of our comfort zone, when we leave the cradle, whether that's the Earth or whether that's these very biologically conditioned notions of what intelligence is, and we start to explore the possibly infinite horizon of possibilities that technology unlocks,
Mm.
that really just deepens the question of what we are. And it deepens the urgency behind us choosing, again, what we really value, because suddenly we don't have to. Right.
Yeah.
That's the significance of it. When you develop arbitrarily intelligent machines, the reason that's profound is not that they will transform the economy or increase GDP
Hmm.
or even that they'll eliminate possibly a lot of jobs. The reason that's profound is that we have to ask ourselves and rearticulate, what do we want the economy to be? What do we
Hmm.
want art to be? What do we want? All these activities that are transformed by this technology, that's not automatic. We decide what those activities mean and what it means for them to be automatable or not. That remains a human question. And in fact, it becomes an even more human question the more the technology advances. So that's the spirit behind all of
Yeah.
the work that I've done as a researcher, as a founder, as a developer. That's across the board for me.
Yeah. It shows a very balanced and introspective of AI, right? To really asking those questions of ourselves and getting the most out of it for good. Keeping the balance there. So I appreciate that answer. So a lot of people still think AI, though, ethics in particular with AI ethics mostly is about compliance or it's PR, right? What do you think they fundamentally misunderstand about the real stakes involved?
I think what's missed from that perspective is, drawing out the implications of what I was saying earlier. If you think that ethics reduces to compliance, really what that means is you're saying ethics reduces to following rules. In other words, ethics isn't a human activity. And that's fundamentally what it's missing. Ethics is not only a human activity, it's a uniquely human activity because it's the lens through which fundamentally what we're deciding is what relationship we have with each other. That's not something you can automate. It's also not something that you can, I think, ever fully codify in law, nor should you try. It's a vital activity. It's a living activity. Each generation has its own way of tackling those questions, besides which I think what we've seen, with this recent news around federal preemption of states being basically forbidden to pass their own distinctive regimes of compliance shows that that whole approach is kind of a farce, frankly, left to its own
Mm.
devices. The reason ethics is not just about compliance is that fundamentally ethics is about self-determination, which is the one thing machines can't do, no matter how intelligent they become.
Yeah, very insightful. It's a living thing that we need to keep on working on Yeah, so that's great, a great answer. Across your work, one of the big themes is that AI is not just a technical system, it's a social and political system. Why is that such an important distinction right now?
It's always an important distinction. Some of the very first algorithms that defined human civilization, I always think about, the very first examples of writing from ancient Babylon. If you look at those ancient tablets and the just extremely simple rudimentary forms of writing that they instantiate, often what they were recording were what you might consider very banal things. They were just recording the number of, the amount of grain that was just harvested in the last quarter. It was very numerical. It was very much like, they wrote what they wrote, not because it was poetic or interesting, but because it was about survival. And they needed to keep records of this, or else the city state could be compromised. It couldn't manage itself. But what immediately happened? Hammurabi, laws as we know them, right, became possible because of that new frame. So the reason I consider AI to be fundamentally, in many ways, more of a social question than a technical one is that it's impossible to build AI to be incredibly smart without changing the society in which it's embedded. The example I always think of here is self-driving cars. When I first started researching AI, again, in like the mid 2010s, trolley problems were all the rage. If your listeners can remember, if they were around then, trolley problems were this idea of like, oh, what should the self-driving car do? If the self-driving car is going to collide with 5 people or something like that, should it divert itself to instead only risk the life of the one person who is in the car, right? Or should it allow itself to continue on the path that it's going? And that's the most profound question. And so for like a couple of years, that was basically about as sophisticated as this kind of AI ethics conversation got. But the reason that frame was wrong is that that's not the ethical challenge of self-driving cars. The problem of self-driving cars is, what do we want cities to be? What do we want roads to be? What do we want sidewalks to be? What do we want the rules of the road to be? That's the question. And it's a deeper question. It's not an obvious question, but it becomes impossible to ignore the more this technology is deployed, because if you go to San Francisco, or if you go to, cities in Arizona, if you go to the places where, especially Waymo, but other fleets now as well, are being massively deployed, those roads don't feel the same that they used to. What it means to be a pedestrian, what it means to be a cyclist, what it means to be a dog is different on those streets, because these fleets do not drive or behave exactly like humans do, even if they're safe in many of the ways that our existing rules and forms of compliance are able to measure. It fundamentally changes the texture of the activity.
Thanks for making that distinction. I appreciate that. So Hortus has been described as building the consumer reports or Wirecutter for AI tools. What gap in the market are you trying to fill, and why has that gap become so urgent?
Yeah, it follows from what I've been saying. It's really the kind of umbrella behind all these examples. I just talked about self-driving cars, but it's a similar issue with chatbots. Okay. So like we get really enamored with like, oh my God, GPT-4 is so much better than GPT-3. Like as if that matters, frankly. Like a few months go by and it's going to be GPT-5 or something like that. And the vast majority of people realistically often could not experience much of a difference between these technologies, but they're enormously hyped. And that's what's conditioning most of the development and deployment of this stuff. So, and besides which, the fact that we now have so many of these chatbots out there makes it so there's this like flooding the zone of misinformation. Basically, most of what you see online soon, if not already, depending on what the site you're at, is AI generated. So the common denominator here, whether it's cars, whether it's chatbots, whether it's other applications, is that the better the technology gets, I put air quotes for those people who are just listening to this, often the worse off we are, because we are stuck in the frame of what that environment used to be rather than what it's becoming. And we can't actually deal with it as these technologies transform it. So what Hortus is doing is basically creating a filtration mechanism in the form of a marketplace that lists thousands of different use cases for AI tools. And we then make, I think now, just as of last week, we list 5,000 different applications across those use cases, and we assess all of them for quality. And those quality dimensions are broken down according to things like security, privacy, usability, and so forth. And really what that does is, like, yes, we do have our own AI tools that enable a lot of the features I just outlined. But fundamentally, what that's doing is solving, I think, the much more urgent and existential problem here, which is what is the human condition becoming
Yeah.
now that these technologies are saturating our being? And how can we adopt, how can we forge some kind of lever of accountability so that we're able to sort the signal from the noise? We're able to sort out what's real from what's snake oil. And then even
Mhm.
among those tools that actually might add value, what are the most appropriate ones for the needs of businesses, schools, hospitals, cities, and consumers, and many other nonprofit organizations? Basically, all these groups whose missions are left vulnerable and at stake at the same time that they could be significantly advanced by this technology.
Gotcha. Thanks for showing us what the urgency is and getting this tool out, getting Hortus out there. So, for someone hearing about Hortus for the first time, what does it really mean to build consumer reports for AI, and what should people be evaluating that they usually wouldn't be evaluating when they would select an AI tool or
Mhm.
use AI?
Yeah. So yeah, I can provide a bit more context there. Hortus is the word for garden. So that's part of the inspiration there. And as I said, I grew up on a farm. So there's that personal dimension of it. For me, and the name of the platform itself, the marketplace I described, is called Trellis. So a
That's
trellis
okay.
is the scaffold in a garden. If you think about, or if you go to like a vineyard, for example, it's the scaffold on which life can grow in a healthy way. So really, what we're aiming to do is we're not just picking winners and losers. And the marketplace is not pay to play in any way. Important that it remain unbiased and impartial, and that the assessments we are doing on all of these listings come from a place of integrity. That's what we bring to the ecosystem, frankly. And that I am sorry to say, but I think all your listeners can sense this. Integrity is pretty sorely lacking overwhelmingly in the AI conversation right now in many ways. So the way we assess is we look at how does the tool not just perform, but relate to people. What does it do to people? What does it transform rather than just automate? I already gave the example. We have transportation, for example, as one of our domains. We have lots of use cases in transportation. So we have Waymo, for example, as a listing on the platform alongside others, right? Other comparable capabilities, algorithms, tools relevant for transportation. And what we look at is saying, well, what are the relationships people are forming with this technology over time? And are those relationships things that they want? Are they healthy? Who have they worked with in the past? How can we verify the terms of that engagement? How are the commitments that the vendor has made to those values I spoke to previously, things like security and privacy and usability? How are those instantiated in the operation of the platform, which in that case would be an automated fleet of vehicles? But we do this distinctly according to domain, which also sets us apart. So we have those same values that we look at across this entire ecosystem, but depending on the domain or depending on the capability, the assessments we make are different because those are fundamentally differently transforming us, right? What it means to
Mhm.
use an agent is not the same thing as what it means to use a machine learning model, for example, or, what privacy looks like in healthcare is not the same thing that privacy looks like in transportation, for example, right? Think about HIPAA
Right.
compliance and how different that is from what you expect in other domains. So our assessments are sensitive to, very richly sensitive to that context and very much designed at the same time to scale impartially across all the listings that are authentically comparable to each other. So that's the balance we're striking. And that's really where, yeah, whether it's the analogies you could make would be either to Consumer Reports or Wirecutter or these really established brands that have a lot of trust. As I like to say, for baby boomers, Consumer Reports is like the gold standard for like picking a car. I think for like millennials or maybe younger Gen X, Wirecutter is more the kind of interface they trust. But the fundamental value that we do that we've learned from those brands is it's not just about ranking cars and saying, here's the best car, right? The real value those brands unlock is what does it even mean to purchase a car today? How is that different than 2025 or 2020 or the year 2000, whenever you last purchased a car? That's what's missing from AI, is that we're overwhelmingly hyped with these capabilities, agentic, that kind of stuff, right? But having the bandwidth to slow down enough, not just to compare what's out there, but in relationship with your own needs so that you can actually understand what is at stake when you are considering whether to adopt an agent as part of your job or your workflow or your life, frankly. That's what we're doing. The role ultimately and the value is more educational. And it's kind of almost more like a public service in that regard than it is just another, commercial AI company on the market.
Yeah. Thanks for giving us a little bit under the hood of how Hortus Trellis really evaluates things. So talk about that. Hortus Trellis has been described as a marketplace to help governments, businesses, and nonprofits make informed decisions. So we're talking about the corporate world now, about AI tools. What problem is Trellis solving that existing procurement processes do not?
I think the problem is this incredible hype cycle that we're in. I mean, that's the immediate problem right now, is that the statistics on this are something like there's a half a dozen new AI startups every hour. Multiply that by a couple orders of magnitude. That's how many agents get deployed every day. The culture of procurement, the expertise of procurement teams is not well matched to that velocity. It's not their fault. I think hype in this context is a deeply troubling dynamic. And what it basically does is, the faster and the more of these applications there are, that unstoppable force, meaning this immovable object of procurement and how involved procurement is, whether that's from, sourcing to evaluating to comparing to soliciting to bidding to purchasing to piloting to implementing, all that cycle. What that conflict does is it, over time, exponentially increases the risk of vendor lock-in. So the risk of either, choosing the wrong vendor, but being unable to pull back or change course, or the problem of the other kind of lock-in is where you're so afraid to be first that you don't commit. And before you know it, 12 months go by and you're that much behind, your competitors or the jurisdictions who have made the commitment. They've hitched their wagon to an agentic workflow. And you're not only maybe
Mhm.
behind in productivity, you're behind in knowledge, you're behind in know-how, you're behind in organizational onboarding, like all that jazz. That's
Yeah.
the problem that we're solving. Is the dynamic has been, these jurisdictions and companies and whatnot, corporations, are understandably very scared to be first, but they're also terrified to be last. And then conventionally, ethics just means, let's just make sure you're not breaking the law and you're compliant. When really the ethical problem is, how do we reverse that doom loop? And people can actually see this as an opportunity rather than something to be afraid of.
Gotcha. So whether being locked in or locked out in a way inappropriate to their business. So we appreciate you stepping us through that procurement process and how it can be valuable for organizations. Since Hortus is really building a new category, not just another software feature, what has been the biggest bottleneck to growth thus far? Educating the market, long institutional sales cycles, or building enough valuation depth fast enough to earn trust?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, to distill all those dimensions, I would say it's the educational component is the biggest challenge. It's also the biggest opportunity. I mean, as I said, this ended up, we kind of discovered this, is that it's not enough to just list all these tools on a marketplace. It's not enough to assess them. It's not enough to make this readily available to anybody who cares to explore it. It really has to be about presenting this documentation, information, context in a way that fits into people's perspectives so that it's actionable. It ends up being a very practical, a very pragmatic question. That has been a big challenge for us. And we have, as a team, my company has worked very iteratively on how to do a better job managing this, how to do a better job meeting people where they are. Until eventually, yeah, we realized, like, actually, this is what we do. This is our differentiator. It's not a roadblock. It's what sets us apart, is the fact that we are so dedicated to resolving these problems for people, so much so that we actually have a policy as a company that, to the extent that we're able, within 24 hours of receiving any question or any complaint about the platform, our platform, we not only address that request within 24 hours, we actually push a fix. We push a hotfix so that the issue itself is actually addressed and reflected in the operation of the platform. So that's an example of what I mean by reversing this doom loop is rather than moving at the speed of hype, we're moving at the speed of accountability in this moment and allowing people to perceive this AI moment as a conversation to be had rather than a threat to be feared.
Okay, very good. So this is how the community is really being involved in the development of Hortus.
It's entirely community driven. Absolutely. And that's, to your question, you're asking what are the biggest challenges. Nurturing that community, blowing on those coals, getting that fire going, inviting and holding ourselves to the standard of what I call actually, and what I tell the team is that we need to hold ourselves to the standard of radical accountability. And the way I've described this to our team is the very common analogy for a startup is that you're kind of building a plane in midair as you're getting closer and closer to the ground. That's often what it feels like to be working at a startup. What we're doing, I tell the team, is actually even a step beyond that, which is we're like if the Wright brothers were dropped in the sky and were falling and had to invent a plane. They had to like design how to do a plane and then build it by the
Right.
time they hit the ground. But I say that because I'm like, actually, this is what we strive for. What we're striving for is we're creating an environment where people should feel comfortable learning and trust that the questions they ask will be answered, and not only answered, but then acted upon as soon as they're received. A lot of startups work iteratively. We're not by any means able to do that. But the difference for us is that the iteration is community driven and social, not primarily technical.
Okay, very good. So I see the education point from different standpoints then as well. Very good. So where do you see the biggest near-term opportunity for Hortus Trellis? Becoming the trusted evaluation layer for public sector AI buying, helping institutions compare vendors more intelligently, or becoming the system that translate really public values into procurement decisions? Where do you think that would lay?
Certainly, right now, we have a lot of B2G traction. So we have over 100 jurisdictions across the United States that are, and internationally as well, that are using Trellis, subscribe to it, and using it to source and vet vendors. So what we've seen is, it's actually, this is an example of what I was saying before to make this concrete. We designed the initial interface to make it so that any listing would be just very searchable. So you can just say like, hey, I'm looking for a chatbot that can do these things, or I'm looking for an algorithm that will help us manage traffic flow this way. And if you search for that, you'll find the top results, the best results for that. We designed it that way. What we actually found was that a much more common use case was that people have just heard of a vendor, but don't know anything about it. And they're like, well, we could just go to their website, or we could see what Hortus would say about them. And so actually became more common for them to just search the name of the vendor. So again, to answer your question, I think the big opportunity for us right now is really locking down serving that market segment of procurement teams, CIOs, CTOs at the often, I mean, medium-sized jurisdictions, but enterprise layer as well, to help them find what they're looking for or vet what they've heard about. I think in the medium term, it is more this opportunity of how can we help inform people's understandings of the entire AI ecosystem, educate people about the market as a whole, rather than just distinct individual vendors. In the long term, though, and you named it, the vision for the company, and hopefully this has been clear in my exposition of my background and what's driven me into this field, it's ultimately to make it possible to re-articulate public values in the context of this technology. That's the great mystery of our time is we talk about making AI safe or making AI, ethical, but we don't live in a safe or ethical world, frankly. And in many ways, day by day or year by year, we live in a less safe and less ethical world, I think, than we did. And there's lots of reasons for that. I don't think AI is helping that right now frankly.
Mhm.
But there's no reason in principle that we couldn't reverse that process and make it so that these profound transformations in how we work, live, play, socialize, relate to each other are redirected towards ends that we choose and articulate rather than whatever happens to be
Mhm.
right at the short-term financial horizon.
That's good. Yeah, so that there's an opportunity right now for you guys for it sounds like B2B, but everybody should be excited that there is the opportunity in the future for B2C, for consumers to be able to use a product like this.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Yeah, good. As the AI tooling market gets more crowded, where do you see the biggest disruption coming from? What are the competitors getting right and what are some missing? How do you keep Hortus Trellis from being seen as just another AI governance or evaluation tool?
Certainly, I think the most movement that we've seen is in the agent side of the market.
Hmm.
And there's a few reasons for that. One is simply the technology has matured. Another is that it is a way to reconceive a lot of legacy applications, right? So even web browsers now are something that companies are reimagining as agents. That whole experience of browsing the web is something that we've all inherited from like Netscape in the
Right.
90s. And there's this potential to just radically reconceive how we relate to, I mean, all the content that can be out there that's not mediated by a browser. Agents make it possible to say, what is a chatbot but an agent waiting to happen? What is a machine learning application but an agent waiting to be deployed? What is a data set but something some agent could have learned on its own? Right? What is a
Mhm. Yeah.
platform but something that an agent could just manage? So we're seeing a lot of movement with respect to that. You asked about what sets us apart in that capacity. It is certainly true that that story I just told is one that's very easily misused. It's one that's very easily abused, frankly. And what I mean by that is it's very easy to market an agent as solving all problems to all people in certain ways. It's another thing to actually be very specific and concrete about, well, why is it better? I just was talking with a vendor about this yesterday. Why is it better to have an agent that can, for example, manage and monitor the environmental impacts of the energy grid in a certain jurisdiction rather than having a CRM, platform that is more readily accessible to and able to be monitored by all the, experts in that municipality, in government, but also not necessarily even in government, so that they can all
Mhm.
keep tabs on this process and surface the unknown unknowns behind data collection, behind sensing, behind stakeholder engagement. You wouldn't trust in a single agent or even a consortium of agents to automate that kind of civil society overnight. But the startups that are building this stuff, understandably, often don't like to think about that or like to justify what they're doing in relation to it. But that's really the question is when is it the right time to hand over those kinds of critical processes to agents? And so our assessments are designed that way. We very much, as I was saying, we design much more robust and specific assessments for agents and agentic workflows to verify, well, why are you better than a non-agentical rather than just how good are you relative to other agents. That's a big part of what we do. And that's completely
Yeah.
different, for example, than say the chatbot arena or these other, kind of like gladiatorial sites that just sort of arbitrarily rank with numbers that almost nobody understands what those mean, frankly, like that one gets 5 points more than the other. And other than just feeding into the hype, it's not really informing people about the sticks of adoption. So that's really what grounds all the distinctive ethical considerations that we bring to the table.
Thank you for qualifying that. And it kind of goes back to education. My question here too is kind of around how people, everyday Americans, really. You likened us on the outset here to with AI to being Appalachians. That we're going to be underserved if this is Horus AI is kind of, we appreciate you kind of developing this so that you've said that everyday Americans should have an active input into how AI works for them. So why is the active input so important, especially when AI is being used in public services like voting, information, parking tickets, or trash pickup? It seems a little bit maybe cold, something just as a service. How is human action? How is active input so important here?
Active input is important because without it, AI cannot learn. It can't distinguish intent from habit. It can't distinguish signal from noise. intent in a in a sense is really the one thing that humans can always bring to the table. The fact that we are intentional beings, we're purpose driven, we're goal directed, is something that it's part of our mystery as a species. AI cannot develop that capacity itself. It can only learn from ours. So without active input, we run the risk of, frankly, what we've seen in the last few years, which is the internet feels like a cesspool of AI slop. Roads no longer even feel like something we can deliberate about, let alone drive on in a way that's like what it used to be.
Hmm.
Take your pick. Your job is no longer something that you might feel completely secure doing without the risk of it being automated in ways that may or may not actually reflect anything about the spirit of what you bring to it. The risk has been that for the last few years, we increasingly feel like the economy is not for us. It's not up for us anymore to really even decide what is of value. And that's profoundly tragic because actually that's the one thing humans can do is decide what is of value and distinguish it from what is not of value. AI can never replace that functionality. I can't overemphasize how there's nothing about the way the technology is built. There's nothing about the way it learns. There's nothing about the algorithms that have permitted all this progress that can remotely touch that human capacity.
Yeah, in one of your white papers, you wrote and argued that today's alignment methods often leave the public. We talk about AI alignment methods often leave the public in a passive role. What's broken about that model, and what does it get wrong about trust?
Well, it creates this doom loop. So basically what that does is it conditions people into thinking that they don't matter except as passive consumers of what companies decide is worth building. And ironically, in the long term, that benefits no one, including the companies, because over time, the AI gets worse because it has less reliable data to learn from, because people's engagement with what they're building becomes more constrained, more ironic. It's less sincere. And as a result, that there's no trust. And the absence of trust makes it impossible and at least prohibitively difficult, bordering on impossible for the technology to distinguish what is real from what is not. And as a result, the behavior it learns becomes increasingly less meaningful and intelligible over time. And we've seen this in this kind of asymptotic curve in how well even the frontier models perform, is that unless they have an incredibly rich cache of intentional, purposeful, active human behavior to draw from, they become highly limited. And I think what we've seen in the race to more power and capability, even amongst the biggest, three companies, reflects that. Google has a lot of advantages, for example, over OpenAI for this reason, because Google's been around for longer and has much richer forms of data and much more expert-driven forms of data that are available to it on that horizon, from which they've been able to fold that, for example, into Gemini. And other companies, other startups don't have that as easily. But I think the problem is there are certain values and priorities and concerns that really do exist at the civilizational level, at the public level. And we haven't yet been given an interface, a lever for that form of data, that form of abstraction, that form of intent to be reliably captured and channeled into the way this technology is being built. And so the long-term vision of Hortus is to serve as an interface for that regime of public accountability. Because without it, AI will actually become stuck at a certain point, and will certainly be stuck because we'll be stuck in this doom loop.
Gotcha. So there builds in the in trust, as you were talking about. So I think you use the term praise, and correct me if I'm wrong. Distill, disclose, deliberate, and deploy. And I think you were talking a little about this when you were talking about people calling in, your users calling in, and you have that 24-hour. We're going to answer the question they have and maybe even patch a problem. So does that fall into that category? Can you walk us through what that framework of praise and explain how it gives the public a more meaningful role in shaping AI?
Yeah, it's a virtuous loop. It is the virtuous loop in action. It's the opposite of the doom loop. It's interesting. In the white paper, I didn't codify what the doom loop would be called, but you can imagine I could just despair. I'm not sure what the D's would be in that case. No, but the distill, disclose, deliberate, deploy is intended to, it's meant to be a circular, a recursive process even, where Basically, information is gathered from people in the form of data, which is used to create tools on the part of these companies. They then disclose critical information about how they have done that and the resultant power, capabilities, performance of what they built. The public then is able to deliberate, come to a decision about which, if any of those tools is in fact worth using. And on that basis is then able to make a decision about which one is to be deployed. That deployment in turn creates a different context for distilling more information, data, behavioral information that is gathered, from that deployment. So it's meant to be a virtuous loop, because the idea is that at these critical stages of development, accountability is introduced. And what that does is bootstrap trust. So in the praise, you mentioned this white paper that
Mhm.
was published in for the company to outline that vision. That policy of that like 24-hour turnaround is a kind of microcosm of that methodology. So what Trellis is doing, what the marketplace is doing, is creating that culture of expectation so that eventually across this entire ecosystem of thousands of vendors and use cases and so forth, that same kind of feedback loop, that same virtuous loop of accountability is first possible and then expected and then actually relied upon in order to build better AI.
Very good. So when you think about those four things: distill, disclose, deliberate, and deploy, where do you think organizations are the weakest today of those four stages?
That's an interesting question. Well, organizations, often in our conversations with vendors, we work with them very closely on the disclosure side of this. It's actually funny. Another kind of sci-fi thought just occurred to me. There's this movie Disclosure Day that's coming out, I think in June. It's like the next Spielberg movie, and it's all under wraps. So it's probably about aliens. But I think the premise of it is that there's a lot in that case, possibly, that the government is not telling anyone about what they know about this thing. And so the whole drama, it's a whole blockbuster film specifically about this one part of the praise framework, which I find kind of amusing. So I think that for many decades now, we've kind of been living in a relationship with powerful organizations where we sense that they might know more than they're telling, or at least that they're only telling it to people that they feel they need to tell it to, and not actually fully disclosing. So I certainly think disclosure is a major organizational challenge, and that we work on a lot with our preferred vendors. But I do think that we also, and all of us, need to get a lot better at deliberating. Again, I mentioned in the last few decades, we really have just grown accustomed to thinking that most of the decisions we make are analogous to, should I renew my subscription to Netflix, or how much better is, it to do Amazon Prime Video versus Peacock or something like that. I mean, these types of highly optimized, but frankly, often arbitrary decisions about where and how to allocate our attention in the few minutes or hours that it's available for us to do so on a given day is the kind of
Mhm.
deliberation that I think most of us feel like we're being conditioned to do. But really, deliberation, and this is, I have this background, so I'm going to indulge it for a second if your listeners will allow it. It's really a philosophical question of, in the classical world, deliberation was understood to mean that's about the good life, basically. Like, how do you choose to live? How do you come to a decision about the most important questions facing the shape, the structure, the texture of your life? That's what's at stake. And that's largely been completely absent from our collective decision making for a very long time. And in the long term, we will need to recover that capacity in order to get AI right, because that's the nature of that problem.
Got it. Thank you. So looking ahead, if Hortus succeeds the way you hope it will, what changes about how communities, institutions, and everyday people decide what kind of AI they actually want in their lives?
If we succeed, it will mean that you feel reflected in the systems that surround you. You'll feel that those systems exist for you. You'll feel it. You won't just believe that the company in question will be sued if it doesn't do that. You'll actually feel, when you wake up in the morning and live out your day and go to bed at night, that the technologies that you have made use of that day, that have shaped the options available to you, do so in a way that supports your potential and actually enables it to be actualized. That's what you'll feel. I don't think many of us have felt like that for a very long time, if ever, with respect to our computers, our cars, our, all these devices that promise convenience, but in fact, often make our lives more complicated. And really, if we succeed, what we're going to do is help people find a way to make AI not just to make your life arbitrarily more convenient at the cost of being worse. What we'll do is find ways to make that technology support you to decide how you want to live. That's what success means.
Yeah. We're looking forward to you guys reaching that level and being successful. That's exciting to hear that somebody's out there doing this, because we definitely need a product like Hortus Trellis. Tom, where can people find you in Hortus AI?
Yeah, people are welcome to visit our website, hortus.ai, but they can also check out the platform itself. So the platform, as I said, Hortus Trellis. The URL for that is trellis.hortus.ai. And people can go ahead and they can search the marketplace. They can find listings. And if they log in, there's a bunch of additional features that we enable, including comparing different options of agents and chatbots and you name it. You're a team or an IT official or a CIO. If you're in that B2B, B2G context, we aim to support as many different procurement stages as you need in order to make it so that when your stakeholders are telling you it's time for us to adopt this, you do it the right way.
Thank you. Dr. Thomas Gilbert on the Argosy podcast. Tom, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Greg. It's a pleasure.
To-
What